Okay, according to a new Australia Institute analysis of economic modelling, the cost of persuading the Nationals Party to support Australia's PM Scott Morrison's net zero target are trivial compared to the cost to the economy. Richie Merzian is the Director of Climate at the Australia Institute and is standing by for more. Richie, lovely to have you company. Thanks for joining us. How is this conclusion made here?
The analysis from the Australian Institute looks at the recently commissioned work by Deloitte from the BCA, which has a 46% emission reduction target by 2030 on a pathway to get to net zero emissions by 2050. Then it looks at previous Deloitte analysis on net zero by 2050 that didn't have that upfront high ambition on climate action. When you compare the two, you find that actually it's having more ambitious short-term climate action, doing more early that releases a lot more climate benefit, around $210 billion worth, and more jobs and more investment and lower electricity prices. So you have to ask the question when you compare these two, what is the analysis that the current government and the Nationals in particular are using to say that actually doing more early will cost more rather than less? That's the real big question, because there's always been a big focus on modelling as the reason with which to move or not move on climate. But when you compare the two, you see that actually Australia should be significantly increasing its 2030 target, something that unfortunately is not on the table right now.
That's really interesting, isn't it, that analysis there, because the Nationals Party's argument has been that it will cost more with these ambitious targets, but you're saying that the analysis is actually proving the opposite there. Let's talk about Glasgow, upcoming historical climate summit, matter of weeks away. What are the expectations there now, Richie?
So we're seeing more commitments come through from additional countries committing to net zero by 2050 or looking at increasing their short-term ambition or taking positions to phase out coal power or phase out internal combustion engine vehicles. The momentum is building in the lead up to COP26, which begins this coming Sunday, the 31st of October. But the focus remains squarely on doing more in the short term, or as President Biden calls it, the decisive decade. And so that's really what the UK as COP president will be looking for, countries to bring forward more ambitious short-term action, especially during the leaders segment, which is the 1st and 2nd of November.
And as well, we know that Scott Morrison, Australia's PM, will be travelling over there, which is some really welcome news and sort of stepping up Australia on that platform there, exactly where it should be, right?
That's right. It's important that a leader comes to these events. Over 100 leaders have apparently RSVP'd, according to the UK. And this is the most politically important climate conference since the Paris Agreement 6 years ago. It is useful having the PM there because he should have the bandwidth with which to actually hit go on more action on climate change for Australia. So that's the expectation, and it's certainly what the US, the UK, the EU, Japan, Canada, New Zealand have all done or said that they're going to do. So we'll feel that pressure internationally, and it's useful having the leader represent.
Absolutely. Now, Richie, I wanted to ask you about something, and it is sort of throwing you in the deep end, but I wanted to get your advice on this and your thoughts. The rest of the world uses a certain amount of nuclear power as the world shifts away from coal. Nuclear, we know, is a zero-emission clean energy source. Now, nuclear power requires uranium. Australia is one of the biggest producers and exporters of uranium right around the world, almost 1/3 of the world's total, actually. So other countries use it safely. Why is Australia so scared to speak about uranium and nuclear power? It's not even in our conversation.
I mean, this is the conversation that would have been good to have 30, 40 years ago. The problem with nuclear energy in Australia is that we don't have a nuclear power industry. The soonest that we could get it up and running would probably be about 15 to 20 years. And in that time, you're going to see Australia hit 100% renewable energy and have some of the cheapest electricity around the world. So in terms of actually bringing power prices down or reducing emissions, we have the alternatives that are ready to scale up right now. The other issue with nuclear is it's uninsurable. The government will have to provide insurance of last resort. It uses up a lot of water. It is hard to locate because most people don't want a nuclear power station in their backyard. And the latest technology around nuclear is mainly around small modular reactors. But the problem is nuclear power stations are built custom-made, We don't have a factory that pumps out nuclear power stations. Ideally, if you was, then you'd be talking about a new situation, but we don't have that, despite that promise coming over years and years and years. So it just doesn't seem to be suitable for Australia when we have great alternatives available right now.
Yeah, but we know the price of uranium is skyrocketing because people know and people are predicting that the demand for uranium and the demand for nuclear power is going to increase. And that's why uranium as a commodity is going up in price at the moment right around the world. Uranium, I guess, nuclear power can be carried on the back of a truck, whereas solar power and solar farms and things like that we know will take up a lot of land. Do you think that this needs to be in our conversation more, Richie, or not? The boat's passed.
I mean, it feels like we have this debate around nuclear every few years. Just last year, there was a big parliamentary inquiry into nuclear power as well. The Australian Institute did a big submission. So we've looked at this issue, quite recently as well. The problem is timing. At the end of the day, it'll just take ages. Yesterday, Matt Keane, the New South Wales Energy and Climate and Treasurer, said that his advice that he received as the Energy Minister of our largest state is it would take at least 15 years even just to build up the skill set to do this. So it's really hard to see how this will play any immediate role. There's no reason why Australia can't continue to export uranium, but it also exports many other resources as well. In fact, uranium isn't one of the top exporters in terms of volume anyway.
Yeah, and I think as well, I think you hit the nail on the head before where you said about when it comes to nuclear, people often relate that back to your likes of Chernobyl, but that was 40 years ago and people often, I don't think, would want it in their backyard, and I think that's also a factor here in that conversation. Richie Merzian, lovely to see you. Catch up with you next week.
My pleasure.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.